Why don't you take a seat and tell me what appears to be the problem? This is the first Consult the Doctor that I am recording in 2022. I had a couple older episodes recorded that have already gone up, but this is the first one being recorded in 2022. What an incredibly useful thing to share. Now, let's talk about some of the questions I have received. This was a question about... I thought this was an interesting question, actually. So the person contacted me and said, I'm summarizing, what about Visconti nib inconsistency? He posted a question on Fountain Pen Network, and some people said, well, yeah, that's just inconsistency, and other people said, yeah, but no manufacturer can actually guarantee consistency within nibs. So even within one manufacturer, you cannot truly have consistency. So tough luck, this is just the way it is. And I gave that some thought, and I feel that we talk a lot about Visconti nibs in Consult the Doctor. I mean, a lot. And here's what I would say to this. I think the consistency or inconsistency that this person was talking about really related not so much to the nib writes or does not write, but referred more to sometimes a medium nib seems to be a fine nib, sometimes a medium nib seems to be a medium nib, sometimes a fine nib seems to be a broad nib, etc. That kind of inconsistency, which is an important difference to make. So I'm not going to be talking about quality control in ways of a nib does or does not write. I'm just going to talk about differences in width of nibs, okay? The differences in widths of nibs. And that, I do think, is a problem. Now, I'm going to go slightly out on a limb here, because I would expect, but I don't make nibs, I would expect that nibs are made in a machine, and that machine polishes a nib, and that a certain level of polishing, removing material of the actual tipping, that creates a fine nib versus a broad nib versus a medium nib, whatever. But having said that, yes, there is an inconsistency. And I don't know how much of that process really is done by hand anymore, especially for larger producers of nibs that produce many, many, many nibs a day, a year, etc. If we just assume that most of that work is done by a machine, and that machine is, I'm assuming, controlled by a computer, you would expect a certain level of consistency, but you just don't. Now, there is the standard, the standard deviation in statistics, right? Which indicates to what degree values vary around a mean. And you can compute that, and you can have a computer compute that for you. I sometimes wonder if the standard deviation is relatively large in the production of nibs, and that as a result, let's say that you make a nib, and I'm just using this for easy speech here. You have a nib that should be 0.5 millimeters wide. Then it is possible that some nibs will indeed be 0.5 millimeters, others will be 0.49 millimeters, others will be 0.51 millimeters, etc. And that's standard deviation. There is a mean, and nibs will vary around that mean. Some will have a little bit more tipping, others have a little less tipping. I sometimes wonder if that is something that comes into play when you look at nibs even from within a manufacturer, because obviously what is a fine nib to Lamy does not have to be a fine nib to Aurora. You set your own standards for what you consider a fine nib as a company. You just know that fine is finer than a medium nib from that company. So I wonder if there's something going on like that, where you just deal with a somewhat pronounced standard deviation, which shouldn't necessarily be the case. I mean, you would expect that those nibs are all produced within a certain specification, but even then, there always is a bit of a standard deviation. And I think that could indeed explain why some nibs just happen to be a bit broader, some nibs happen to be a bit finer. And I'm assuming that that is something that the person who answered that question on Fountain Pen Network was trying to allude to. There's just a natural variation. It's impossible unless you really have someone doing this by hand, grinding every nib by hand, taking calipers to each and every nib that leaves the factory, and so to speak, filing off whatever needs to be filed off, or discarding what is too broad or what is too fine, etc. Which I'm pretty sure doesn't happen. I don't know if that answer makes any sense, but that's what I came up with. I thought the next question was also an interesting one. Just writing down timestamp. Can pens write differently on different days if you take into account such things as temperature, humidity, etc.? I don't see why not. Because I do think that those kinds of factors like humidity will affect how a pen writes a little bit. I don't know if it's going to be a night and day difference. Because this person who asked this question said some pens seem smoother one day than the next. I'm sure that those kinds of factors like temperature, humidity, etc. come into play a little bit, but I think there are other factors too. I'm assuming that we're talking about on the same paper and with the same ink, but clearly those two factors are very different. I mean, write on some moleskin paper and then write on something like Clairefontaine and then see the difference, right? One paper has a bit more texture, the other is smoother, one is very absorbent, the other is coated, etc., etc. So I think those kinds of factors obviously come into play. There may be slightly less obvious factors like humidity and temperature. Sure, why not? I wonder if there is also a psychological aspect to that we just feel that something is smoother. For example, it is known that our perception works in such a way that if we have been driving on a highway for a long period of time, I'm just doing this in kilometers an hour if you don't mind, but if you've been going 120 kilometers an hour for an extended period of time, then you go onto another road where you can only do 80, you drop 40 kilometers an hour. But interesting finding is that people then have trouble correctly estimating their speed because they've been going so fast for a while. Now they have to slow down, and they tend to speed more because they perceive their speed differently from what it really is. They now perceive that they're actually going slower than they really are, so they're actually speeding. Just because you have to adjust to being at a different speed, different type of velocity. And it takes a little bit of time for our brains to work around that and to work on that. I actually put ink on my head, didn't I? Okay, shouldn't wave this pen around. Now, having said that, I could see how something like that comes into play as well. If you have been using a super smooth pen earlier that day, and then you switch to a pen that was smooth yesterday, but that is not quite as smooth as the pen that you were using earlier today, then that second pen is probably going to feel a little less smooth than it did yesterday. My money is on some sort of more psychological experience there, because I doubt that an increase in humidity of 3% is going to dramatically affect the way a pen feels to you. But I don't know. I haven't scientifically tested it. That's just my hypothesis. Next question. Why do you always write, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog"? That was actually a good question. It's a nonsensical thing to write, really, because it's a pangram, and a pangram means that it's one sentence that has all the letters of the alphabet in it. And that makes a lot of sense when you are using that for the purpose those kinds of pangrams were developed, which is not just an intellectual hobby, but they're very useful for testing out the keys on a typewriter to see if everything works. Now, if a fountain pen can write the letter A, it can probably also write the letter B, and I'm quite sure it can write the letter C. But, just because I wanted to have something that has upstrokes as well as downstrokes, maybe some diagonal things, etc., I just chose that sentence. I could have chosen many other sentences, but I chose that one. And given that I did that from my first videos, it kind of stuck. And other people do that too, and some people have different sentences, and other people just write quotes, and all of that's fine because it doesn't matter. You don't have to write every single letter with every fountain pen because, again, if it can do one, it can probably also do the other. Having said that, Again, some pens struggle more with upstrokes or with downstrokes, so I try to include every letter so that I can tell whether it does that. And that's the reason I do that. Final question. Will you ever stop reviewing fountain pens? Probably. I mean, let's be fair. I've been doing this for a decade now. Over a decade. It's a long time to do anything. What I will say is, at this point in time, I'm still enjoying reviewing fountain pens. At least most of the time, I am enjoying it. Will there ever be a moment where I will no longer enjoy it? Probably. Probably, because again, doing something for a long period of time at some point can get a little old. So there probably will be that type of era, an S.B.R.E. Brownless era. Maybe then I will do something else on YouTube. Maybe I will not. Maybe there won't be any YouTube. I think what's important for us to remember, I just pulled this off my chair and then it fell. What's important for us to remember is that nothing lasts forever. And I don't think you should underestimate that. Nothing lasts forever. And that probably includes S.B.R.E. Brown reviews. Now, having said that, at this point in time, I don't really have the intention to stop reviewing anytime soon. But who knows? Life situations change, all kinds of things change, and there may be that moment one day. But it won't be this day. So we're safe for a little bit. Also, this video is going to go up at some point, but as I'm recording this, it's January 9th, and I already have videos scheduled until early March. So I mean, I always have quite a bit of stuff coming in, and I'm reviewing that stuff. So there is a buffer. So it's probably not going to be a matter of at some day it's just, you know what, that will phase out, and I will know. You know when it's time. And for me, it's not yet time. So there we have it. If you have any further questions, please leave them below. Thank you for watching, and I will gladly see you later. Bye.